Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Open Apereo 2015. My name's Ian Dolphin. I'm the Executive Director of the Apereo Foundation. In a few moments, I'm going to be speaking for around 15 minutes on some of the high points of this year, and then I'm going to be followed by our keynote, David Wiley. But before that, I'd like to welcome Paul Walsh, who's the Assistant Vice President for Academic Innovation and Instructional Support at the University of Baltimore. Paul works on distance learning, has been working on distance learning since 1987, and has been with the University of Baltimore since 2005. The University of Baltimore actually run the oldest fully online MBA program in the United States and offer many other online degrees and certificates. So, Paul, thank you very much.
Good morning. Welcome to Baltimore. On behalf of Baltimore and the University of Baltimore, we're delighted you're here in our city. Despite what you may have heard in the media, Baltimore remains a great place to live and to work. I've traveled to 49 states in this country, and I'm glad to call Baltimore, Maryland home. Baltimore, like many cities, maybe even like one of your own, is facing some great challenges. Great challenges are often coupled with great opportunities. The problems our city faces are larger than those that just one person can solve. The residents of this city, those who work here, and those who live in surrounding areas and throughout the state of Maryland, must all contribute to make this city better. It might also be true that the solutions and models that we devise could also help improve things in other cities, maybe even yours. That kind of community-based commitment to improvement is at the heart of the open source model. It's why the University of Baltimore chose Sakai. We all have a voice. We can all contribute. We all need to be a part of a solution that our community needs. You're all good people. You might be asking yourselves how you might be able to help. Well, many businesses here in Baltimore, here around the harbor, are still trying to recover from losses suffered throughout the spring. So, go shopping. Now's your chance to go pick up that, let's say, Orioles baseball cap you always wanted, or the Ravens jersey. Or at least you might be able to leave a generous tip for your wait staff or the housekeeping staff here at the Renaissance. Thank you for coming to Open Apereo 2015. Thank you for coming to Baltimore. Enjoy your time in our fair city. Thank you.
And thank you, Paul, very much for coming and providing those words. This event would not be the success it always is without the work of a huge number of volunteers. I would like to call out some of those volunteers now. Our program and planning committees, if you've served on those, Reba Anna, and Mike Stewart, who co-chaired our program committee, Laura McCord, who chaired our planning committee, stand up now if you're in the room. Anybody who worked on those committees? There's got to be more than one. You know, this week is always a place we celebrate. We're going to be doing a bit of celebration in a few minutes when I walk through some of the achievements of the last year. But our two programs, our Teaching with Sakai Innovation Award program and our Fellows program, are, I think, a critical part of this community. They're an important part of this community. So, Salwa, I know Beth isn't here. Salwa and Anthony, are you in the room? And everyone else, of course, who served on those groups. So, I want to do a quick run-through of some of the high points of the last year for Apereo. We've got some breaking news here. It's only been released this weekend, so there'll be stars where you can catch that latest announcement. And I want to begin with an initiative which is one of our youngest initiatives. It's only just over a year old, our Learning Analytics initiative. It's hitting and working in a key area for higher education currently. You can't open a magazine or a journal, read the Chronicle, the Times Higher without finding something about analytics. And it's really an important exemplar of how Apereo set out to work and how we are working. We are open. We're about openness. We're about partnership. And we're about dialogue between different communities. And our Learning Analytics Initiative work has been very much a partnership of Apereo, of the Society for Learning Analytics Research, and worked with agencies like JISC in the UK, SURF in the Netherlands. Our institutions have worked in it, our commercial partners have worked in it. It's an important exemplar of partnership. If you have not seen this diagram before, you will see some more of it this week if you attend one of the Learning Analytics sessions. And really, this is the platform that we are evolving. Learning activities collection on one side, learning activities stores, a learning activity processor, dashboards to communicate, and applications like Student Success Plan that work with that data to solve problems for students and solve problems for institutions. So this weekend we moved 3 components in that platform into our incubation process. Our Learning Analytics Processor, Open LRS, a Learner Record Store, and Open Dashboard. So you're going to see a lot more of that this week. I'm going to come back to this in a moment. 3 projects entering incubation. We have cause to celebrate this week as Opencast graduate from incubation this weekend. Opencast is a lecture capture and media management platform. It's being used at very significant scale in some institutions. Look at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. And Opencast is capturing and managing tens of thousands of lectures. If you want to see some really good evidence about why lecture capture and management are important for students, then go along to Stephen Marquard's talk later this week, because Cape Town have done some research in this, and I am sure that you will find it very interesting. Another graduate from incubation, the Xerti project, which had its origins at the University of Nottingham in the UK. Xerti is an authoring toolkit and authoring environment for interactive and accessible learning materials. And again, if you read the education press and follow the education press news, you'll see how accessibility is a pretty hot topic at the moment. If you get a chance to catch Xerti this week, and I know they have a session on Wednesday morning, I'd strongly advise it. Now, noting those 2 graduations, I just want to hop back to that Learning Analytics platform diagram that I put up earlier. Now, I do not get to tell our software communities what to do. That's as it should be. Our software communities set their own priorities, and that's one of Apereo's fundamental principles. But I do, now and again, get to ask what I think are interesting questions. And if you look there and look at the learning systems that we support, Sakai and OAE, which are equipped with analytics data feeds around the Experience API standard, then, well, that's a great step. But wouldn't it be interesting if, in addition to those learner activity feeds from those 2 platforms that we support, learning content like the content authored by Xerti provided that kind of data? If you look at the Opencast architecture in detail, you'll see server software and player software. Wouldn't it be interesting if academic media content provided activity feeds in those ways? We're really beginning to talk then about a very rich data store, significantly enhanced on the early work that we've undertaken so far. There's some other good news in learning, in our learning analytics space. Last week, some of us were at a meeting in London with the JISC, it used to be the Joint Information Systems Committee. It provides services and infrastructure, amongst other things, for UK higher education. 3 of the components that are developing as part of that learner analytics platform that we're supporting have been adopted by the JISC to be put into service, national service within the United Kingdom. The Learning Analytics Processor I mentioned, Open Dashboard, and Student Success Plan. That is a big deal. And we should call out, I think, in that respect, the work that Marist College and Unicon have done to move that, have that dialogue with the GIST and get that support. So I'd like to give them a big hand now. And there's something else interesting in terms of the potential impact on that platform and the richness of data that I mentioned, because that work will feature both information about learners held in library systems and how they interact with library systems and materials that library systems hold, and the national collection data that the GISC holds. So that, I think, is going to be a very big deal in the coming year. In terms of incubation, one of the primary goals of Apereo was to establish a working incubation process so that we could openly and transparently develop new projects in our community and bring projects that were outside our historic communities inside it. So Unitime, a comprehensive scheduling and timetabling application, graduated from incubation in March this year. Again, opportunities to see Unitime this week, please take them. Proceeding through incubation, Karuta, a next-generation e-portfolio framework, and EdExchange, a project to establish secure peer-to-peer transcript exchange between institutions. They're proceeding through incubation. I've highlighted the graduates, but I do want to emphasize that graduation from our incubation process is not the only way this process has been a success. We've had one project, ThinkSpace, that proceeded through the process and decided to take another course. But they did discover, I think, that their path was a different one, but a healthy one. So when we don't graduate projects, that's not a failure. That's a success because we've explored something. We've found a different direction. We've refined our incubation process in the light of some of the experience of now a year and a half of running it. Those refinements are on the website. Take a look at them. We're trying to simplify things. It's always good to simplify things. I want to call out here again the role of the mentors in our process, because our incubation process is not simply words on a virtual page. It's a live process where people with experience from across our community bring that experience to bear for the benefit of projects which are still in their early stages, still developing. So a big thanks again to our incubation mentors for their work over the last year and a half. And I'd ask you to think, as you're here this week and as you look at our projects, whether there isn't a role for you in being a mentor for our incubation process. I would place a safe bet that everybody in this room has got some useful experience to bring to bear. So I would urge you to think about being an incubation mentor volunteer. We get some training provided by the University of Oxford's OSWatch, Open Source Software Watch, and we have discussions, I think, that develop ourselves as mentors in addition to developing projects. We have got a new process for the formation of communities of interest in place, and we're going to be spending some time focusing on communities of interest in the coming period. Again, while we're celebrating, I'd like to mention two new Apereo-wide communities of interest that will be kicking off. One focused around that important issue of accessibility that I mentioned a few moments ago, and thanks to Matt Clare from Brock for taking point on that and agreeing to chair that group. Another on internationalization. We're a global community. This is a critical community of interest for us in terms of working across projects to gather and share experience. So thanks to Nico Mathis from Research and the Open Academic Environment Project for agreeing to chair that community of interest. We have 11 software communities at the moment. I could walk through them and tell you high points of each one of them, but then you wouldn't get to hear David, you'd just get to hear me, so I'm not going to do that. All of these communities are dynamic and evolving. I'd urge you to go and take a look, not just at projects that you're familiar with over the next few days, but take a look at some of the projects on that list you might barely have heard of, because all of them have got something interesting to say. I do want to pick out one new agreement that one of our projects is exploring, because I think it's potentially important for the future. Doesn't seem fair to single a project out, but the new Open Academic Environment cooperative hosting arrangements, again, the details are on the website, provides cloud hosting via a cooperative agreement, a partnership with a commercial entity, one of the key OE stakeholders, research. We provide institutions with choice. You can still download the software and run it as you would other open source software. By the way, there's nothing being held back here. Everything that is developed for the hosted service gets back into the software. The software is still running, still being provided under an Apache license. There is nothing up our sleeve. There are no tricks because we're open. No licensing change. The Apereo board met in April and indicated a few priority areas that we wanted to consult the community around. That consultation process really begins this week at our AGM tomorrow afternoon, but it'll take place online over the coming months, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how to engage with that in a second. We think it's quite important that we begin to deepen our understanding of openness and its relationship to the curriculum. So we're going to be much more about engaging faculty and students in the coming period. And again, there are lots of ways that you can help that by engaging in discussion and by helping to volunteer around that work. We also want to build connections with our own alumni. I was looking at the Twitter stream this morning, and I was seeing several people who have been regular attendees of this conference who've actually moved outside education. You know, it happens. We are suggesting that we want to build a stronger connection to those folks who've moved on. And we're going to we're going to propose an individual membership program. We want to fund specific areas of work with that. We want to fund interns programs, want to fund the recognition programs that we run, like fellows and like Teaching Innovation Awards. But it's important that we do this in a measured way. So the consultation is going to be open. It will take a little while. And we're very, very critically going to be absolutely certain that we retain the character and the mission of our organization as a meeting place for educational institutions. And the institutional voice is still going to be the strongest one. But we do feel that by encouraging individual membership, we can encourage some strands of activity, such as the ones that I've just spoken about, that in a very positive way. So, new mailing list. We've got an announcements list. We'll be putting out some details about what we propose for that individual membership program within a week or so. Talk about it at the AGM tomorrow. But open@apereo.org is going to be the place where everyone can discuss these or other issues. It's very important we do that because you'll see these words throughout the week. It's also very important to recognize everything we do is 100% open, still 100% open. So with that, I would like to introduce David Wiley, who I've followed for many years, and I'm sure you have, his work in the field of learning objects and open educational resources. David is founder and chief academic officer of Lumen Learning, and I'd like to call on you to welcome David now.
Thanks, sir. Well, good morning. Seriously? Good morning. Good morning. Yay, all right. Okay. I'm glad you're awake. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you a little bit this morning and take us away from technology and take us back more toward faculty and students and the curriculum, as Ian was just suggesting. Of course, the slides and the content of the slides are all open, and you can grab them from my slide share if you'd like them. But I want to start by talking about infrastructure in general. You know, when we think of infrastructure, we think about the network, or we think about roads or water or power, things like that. Brett Frischman at Yeshiva University just in 2012 just released a book on infrastructure from the perspective of intellectual infrastructure particularly that was really quite fascinating. And this is one of the definitions he provided there. I'm going to come back to it again and again in the presentation. Resources that create benefits for society, primarily not in and of themselves, but by facilitating these downstream productive activities. And I think that's kind of a code word for innovation, right? Other things that happen later on, further on, that are productive, that other people are engaging in and making happen, that we don't necessarily have our eyes on at the beginning, right? The people who created roads didn't do that with an eye toward UPS coming into existence, or the creators of the network didn't do it with an eye toward Google or Facebook coming into existence. Eric and Adam are doing work in complementary areas. If you don't know these two bodies of work, I'd highly recommend them. I'd be surprised if many of you didn't know Eric's work on democratizing innovation. But Adam's work on permissionless innovation as well, I think, really applies here. Adam's at George Mason, Eric's at MIT. Providing tools and opportunities for people to engage in the innovation process is the kind of the message of the democratizing innovation work, whereas the permissionless innovation work is maybe a little easier to understand from its name, just getting out of the way and letting people have the opportunity to engage in the things they want to engage in terms of permissions, so that they can do things like this. This might be my favorite quote of all time. This is Linus talking about how the evolution of Linux. And I won't break the first rule of PowerPoint by reading it to you. I'll let you do it yourself. But you get the sense that this iterative cycle of experimentation with feedback coming into that, driving new cycles of experimentation, really is key to the evolution of interesting work and interesting products. So there's a relationship here between infrastructure and innovation that I want to try to draw out. And that is that when the pieces of the infrastructure that are available to us are available, going back to Eric and to Adam's work, when they're available in a way that's relatively expensive and in a way that provides us with broad permission, then that makes it easier for innovation to happen. Two counter examples. Think about broadband. If broadband to the average home cost $500 a month or cost $5,000 a month, is there any way that Amazon exists if it costs $5,000 a month to get broadband at your house? No. Does Google exist? No. For our purposes, do online courses exist? No. Who has that kind of money? The cost piece of it is important. Likewise, on the permission side, you think about radio, you think about television. What if it required a broadcast license for you to publish video online? Or just to publish writing online? Right? Do blogs exist? Does YouTube exist? Does Twitter exist? None of these things exist in a world where you have to get permission to be able to publish. And of course, online courses probably don't exist either. So hopefully very quickly here, this isn't the main point of the talk, so I just want to touch on it and keep going, but I want to persuade you that innovation is really best able to thrive when the conditions are right, when permission is broadly available, when the costs are very low, and the costs and obstacles to experimenting are low. So Brett comes back around from infrastructure and talks about intellectual infrastructure specifically in this way, simplifying a little bit because it's a little further down into the book. But he says intellectual infrastructure is non-rival input into a wide variety of outputs. Non-rival here being an economic term, meaning things that I can use without my use of them doesn't preclude your use of them, like ideas, for example. My having and using an idea doesn't preclude you from having and using an idea, but my drinking a glass of orange juice precludes you from drinking it. So that would be a rivalrous input, but non-rival inputs into a wide variety of outputs. So what's the intellectual infrastructure of education? I think when you hear infrastructure at this conference, it's probably more technical, but I want to step back from the technical piece of it and just think about education broadly. What are the pieces of the intellectual infrastructure of education? I'd say that there are three things. There are outcomes, whether you want to call them learning outcomes or learning objectives or competency statements. Whatever the learning goal is, these statements of what people should learn are a key piece of the infrastructure. The activities that we ask students to engage in, whether that's a quiz or a test, an exam, an assignment, some kind of discussion that we're going to ask them to engage in, but the statements of those quiz items or those activities, those are a key piece of the intellectual infrastructure, and then the resources that we ask students to engage with, whether those are videos or textbooks or simulations or games, whatever they might be. And I've put them in this order specifically because we jokingly refer to this sequence as backward design in the instructional design community, because you want to start with what you want students to be able to do. Once we've actually spelled and laid out what it is we want students to be able to do, then we have to ask ourselves the question, what could students do to persuade us that they had actually mastered those skills that we wanted them to master? What kind of evidence could they possibly provide to us to persuade us of that? And then based on that evidence that we want them to be able to create, what kinds of resources do we need to have them engage with, and in what kinds of ways, so that they can succeed on these assessments to persuade us that they've achieved these learning goals. We call that backwards design because normally the way it works is you get a textbook, you look at the textbook, and you try to figure out how to reverse engineer it into your syllabus to go on and teach the class that you're supposed to teach. But these are, think about, how is it possible to do education without any of these three pieces? Can you do education without reference to any resources at all? Without knowing what the goals are? Without having some kind of assessment strategy and activity strategy so that you know when students have achieved the goals you want them to achieve? These are the intellectual infrastructure components for education. But coming back to Adam and Eric's work, unfortunately, these are relatively expensive and come with very narrow permissions the majority of the time. So that only people with a significant amount of money can really afford to experiment and even attempt to innovate in this space. Just a couple of examples. I'm sure you've all seen graphs like this at some point, but here's textbook prices compared to consumer prices over the last couple of decades. Depending on where you start counting. When you start counting from 1970, I think it's about 850% over that period of time that those prices have increased. I love these little e-cards. I like this one in particular. Any of you paying for textbooks for a son or daughter or other person that you know right now? Yeah. We don't need to belabor this point. Textbooks are just ridiculously expensive. And imagine if you're trying to engage in some kind of innovative, who knows what it might be. Maybe you want to start a new university, or you want to start a new high school. Maybe you're trying to engage in some kind of experimentation around education, and the first thing you have to do is go acquire a bunch of these materials so that you have them at the ready to use. This is an incredible expense. Cerritos, I'm picking on Cerritos just because I know them and I know this program. But, there are a number of examples of places you could look in the U.S. right now at community colleges where tuition actually costs less than the textbook students are required to pay for the classes that they're taking in those programs. My particular favorite way of thinking about the ridiculously high cost of textbooks is this chart. You're a student, you've got $20. What do you want to do with it? You can get access to every movie and every TV show ever created for the month, or for only a few dollars more, you could access one biology textbook. And you know that that's the way students, when they have $20 in their pocket, are thinking about it. It's a trade-off. What am I going to do? And why does one textbook cost more than 50,000 movies and TV episodes? Any Ursula Le Guin fans in the room? Yay, good room. Okay. So when Sparrowhawk goes to the tower to learn names, I should back up a little bit because not that many hands went up. So Wizard of Earthsea is a trilogy. Well, it started as a trilogy. Now I think it's about 8 books. Long time before Harry Potter went to Hogwarts, that little knockoff. This guy, Sparrowhawk, went to the island of Roke to learn magic. And the core of the magic system in this universe has to do with names and naming. If you know the true name of a thing, you can control it. And you can kind of bend it to your will, which makes learning the true names of other people one of the kind of great undertakings in this magical universe. But the way that they learn names is they go to what's called the Isolate Tower on the far north bleak end of the island, and they go up into this tower and they read these names, lists and lists and lists of names of rocks, different kinds of plants, the different seas, the different mountain ranges, everything in their world to try to memorize all their true names. And they're motivated in this study in that each list that they're given in the morning is written in ink that will disappear at midnight. So you have till midnight to learn all the names that you need to learn that day and go on. Now, why is a sparrowhawk showing himself here in the middle of our presentation? It's because if you look at what most of our campuses are doing to try to address the textbook affordability problem, we're using what is essentially a disappearing ink kind of strategy. You think about textbook buyback programs, you think about rental programs, you think about the types of DRM that ebooks come with, or online subscriptions where you have access to materials. And what do all of those have in common? Those all have in common at the end of the semester, the student no longer has access to any of their curricular materials because I've either sold my book back or I gave back my rental or the DRM deleted the textbook off of my device or my subscription ended, my password doesn't work anymore. And it is not lost on students when we say to them, these courses are so important, you cannot graduate without taking them. And since you will never, ever need this again, come sell your book back to the bookstore. They hear those two messages coming together and they realize how ridiculous they are. Somehow we miss out on that ridiculousness. But this idea that our answer to the problem of textbook affordability should be just to deny students access to materials, I don't think is the best one. So that's enough about textbooks. We could talk about each of the pieces of the infrastructure here. But just one more example in terms of assessment. What's in Texas' $500 million contract with Pearson for testing, which is now actually not going to Pearson this next time around, but is going to ETS, and now that's a big lawsuit because, of course, Pearson was banking on that $500 million, and there's a lawsuit about that now. Well, so it's very expensive. The pieces of the educational infrastructure are very expensive, and they also come with very, very narrow permissions as opposed to the broad permissions we wish that they did. Sometime when you need a good laugh, I'd invite you to go to pearson.com/permissions and just look at what you need to do if you want to get permission to use some Pearson material. You can't read this, so I'll read a little of it to you because it's just so fun. The first paragraph here says, request for permission to use any of our copyrighted content must be in writing and sent to the appropriate person. So if you send it to the wrong person, too bad for you. You're not going to get any help. You're not going to get any love there. You got to get it to the right person to start with. And you have to send it in writing. And what do they need to know from you? They need to know the intended audience, how many persons will view the content, the dates during which they'll be using the content, a description of the access and usage control methods. Will there be a password? Permission for different web pages you want to use. Your fax must include the URL address. Okay. Anyway, if you're two guys in a garage trying to start some interesting new education something, this is not a process that you can navigate. Which, by the way, after you finish navigating this process is going to result in you finding out how expensive it will be. Permissions are a bear. The Coursera terms of use. I picked on Coursera about a particular term in their terms for several years, and they recently replaced it, which I'm glad about. But the terms do still include things like this. You agree not to accept credit for completing a course unless you've earned a verified certificate. So I, as a faculty member, can't send you off to Coursera to say, hey, go brush up on your Python or go do something else. And when you're done, come back and into the course, and we'll take you the rest of the way through and give you the credit. You're not allowed to accept actual credit for usage of these courses unless you pay them for a verified certificate. If you don't pay Coursera, you're not allowed to take that credit. I just have to step back for a second and say, everybody understands that the whole Coursera, Udacity, edX everybody understands their relationship to the LMS market, right? And what a crazy kind of LMS play that is. I mean, in what world is Blackboard the headline and like MIT and Harvard and Yale are subservient to that brand, which is exactly what we're seeing happen with Udacity or Coursera being the headline and university names being subservient to that brand. There's something very strange and very backward going on here. On the permission side, faculty have a tendency to just want to hide behind the Teach Act. or, say, fair use. So my librarian told me if it's less than 10% of the total amount of content, I'm allowed to do anything I want, because that falls under fair use. And whether or not the particular use they're trying to make of these pieces of the educational infrastructure is a fair use or not, or might be covered by the TEACH Act or not, you end up doing it with the door closed in a way where your little hack might benefit the 30 students you're working with, but there's no way to form a community around that because you can't put it out in the open where people can see it. You've got to keep it closed because that's part of what makes the use fair. That's part of what makes it qualify under the TEACH Act. So these pieces of the infrastructure are there, and there's so many things that we could do with them, so many things that we want to do with them, but they're relatively expensive, and they come with very narrow permissions. And these are huge obstacles to people who are trying to experiment and do something new and do something different. So when you have trouble with costs and permissions, what do? You talk about open. So what do these pieces look like if we were to talk about an open education infrastructure? What do open outcomes look like? What do open activities or open educational resources look like and mean? Well, first we have to say which open, because heaven knows there are enough answers to this question. Now, in this community, I think everybody gets it in the context of software. How does the openness of content need to differ from the openness of software? When I first kind of got started back in the business back in '98, just a couple months after the famous February meeting where folks got together and decided, hey, this whole free software thing, there's the way that's played, the optics of that, particularly from the business partner world, aren't great. Maybe we should call it something else. Maybe we should call it like open source software. That was in February. And then in June, I said, well, maybe we should have this other thing. Maybe we should call it open content, and we should talk about all the stuff in the world that's not software, that people care about, that's important for education. And the very first thing that I did was I went and I grabbed the GPL and started playing around with the GPL, trying to make it fit content instead of software. And, the notion of libraries doesn't make a lot of sense in the world of textbooks or of videos. And you'll see some projects today still that depend on kind of either the OSI framework or go back to the GPL to look at the way that they define open. I don't think that's the best way to do it in the context of content. The first thing that bears saying in the content context is that open isn't just loosely equivalent to free. I mean, the entire internet is free in terms of content. You go and you read the New York Times, you read CNN, you read National Geographic. All these things are free for you to read. All this content is free, so that's not interesting. Open, of course, means free plus permissions. In fact, the way that we think about content think about openness in the world of content is in these two ways. A two-part definition. One, content that you have free and unfettered access to, so I don't have to give you my zip code or my email address or something like that to be able to gain access to the content. And that there's a license that comes with that content that gives me perpetual, irrevocable permission to engage in what we call the 5R activities, and these are the 5 Rs. Retain, reuse, revise, remix, and redistribute. These probably sound pretty familiar to most folks in this room, so maybe I won't belabor them, other than to say that retain really is the fundamental R here. If I can't make my own copy and own my own copy, then I probably can't engage in any of the other R's here. I might not be able to depend. Certainly can't depend on being able to reuse it later because you might take your copy down. I can't redistribute copies that I can't make. And I can't either make changes internally to the thing in terms of revising it, or I can't take 2 or 3 or 4 of them to create a mashup with if I can't get copies of them. Owning and making a copy in a world of Netflix and streaming access is really important, because if you can only access something, then you don't own it. And I would go so far as to say that this kind of fetish almost toward access among commercial media companies really is nothing short of a war on private property. They don't want you to own a copy of the song. They don't want you to own a copy of the TV show. They don't want you to own a copy of the movie. They want you to have to pay a subscription again next month if you want to listen to it again next month, or pay a subscription next month if you want to watch it again next month. If you buy the DVD, they're never going to make any more money off of you. and they can't control what you do with it. If you buy a copy, there's a thing called the first sale doctrine that says that copy belongs to you and you're allowed to do things with it. But if you never actually buy anything, if you only lease access to something for a month or for 6 months or then there is no first sale doctrine. There was never a sale. Now you're bound to the terms of the contract. I can't say enough how important this point is. We have to hold on to ideas of ownership. Access is not going to cut it going forward. So we have to be able to make and own a copy that we control and we can keep, and then we have these permissions to engage in these other activities with regard to our copy. And I would assume, just by show of hands, Creative Commons. I assume most of you are familiar with Creative Commons. Those of you who aren't raising your hand, I assume, are asleep at this point. In the open educational resources space, in terms of the open education infrastructure, there are really only a couple of licenses that are prevalent: the non-commercial license, the what we shorthand as the Wikipedia license, the BISA, and the attribution license. Nobody can tell you what non-commercial means. Creative Commons can't even tell you what non-commercial means, so that's sort of problematic. The share-alike requirement, the copyleft requirement in BISA, leads to issues like this, where among Creative Commons' own licenses, some licenses aren't compatible with each other, and you can't remix, say, material from MIT OpenCourseWare with material from Wikipedia, because those are two different licenses that both have a copyleft-like clause that are incompatible with each other. And so, for those reasons, people have really focused in on the attribution license as a license now, that if you were to get a grant from the federal government, or you were to get a grant from a major foundation like Gates or from Hewlett, you'd be required to use this attribution license on the materials that you'd create. So again, in the context of the open education infrastructure, by open we mean two things: free and unfettered access, and then this idea of perpetual, irrevocable permission to engage in these 5R activities. Not to be confused with this word, which I love, FOPEN, which is fake open. And when you hear people say, we believe, I saw just a couple of days ago, I can't remember how long ago it was shot, but just a few days ago I saw a video of the president of McGraw-Hill saying, we believe open learning is the future. I thought, man, that's probably true, but whatever your definition of open is really different from my definition of open. When you see things that are free but don't grant you any permissions, or free but require personal information from you and give you even less permissions than all rights reserved, like the Coursera terms of use, right? There's nothing on CNN that tells me I'm not allowed to receive credits for coursework that uses that material. So in that sense, the Coursera terms of use are even more aggressive, even more locked down than just traditional copyright. I think these are things we could and should appropriately call FOPEN, not really open. And of course, the connection back here to infrastructure is that this idea of free and unfettered access and broad permissions addresses those issues of cost and permissions that we were talking about before in terms of Eric's work and Adam's work with democratizing innovation and permissionless innovation. So open education infrastructure. What happens if you start trying to deploy this open education infrastructure in your classroom as a faculty member? I'd invite you to have a look at the review project. The Open Education Group is a research group I'm a participant in at Brigham Young University, where I'm still an adjunct. I used to be full-time on the faculty there. But just to roll this up, this is a project that's going out and looking for good quality empirical studies of the impact on, in this case, learning outcomes, the percentage of students who finish courses with a C or better, the percentage of students who actually sign up for the course, who complete the course, when faculty take and pull commercial textbooks out and replace those completely with open educational resources. So currently there's 11 peer-reviewed studies covering just under 50,000 students across those 11 studies, across something like 60 or 70 different institutions. And the core finding across all those studies is that 93% of students either learned, I shouldn't go to learning. I should use the actual metrics. So we're talking about the percentage that pass the course with a C or better, or the percentage who begin the class, who ultimately finish the class. 93% of students in these studies had either the same outcomes or better outcomes. than students in control classes that were continued to use commercial textbooks. And in some cases, that's the same faculty member teaching that same course in semesters previously before they made the switch. And in other cases, it's students in other classrooms where if there are any research geeks in the house, where the control treatment balancing is done using propensity score matching and then balanced out over a number of other covariates. And then just looking at perceptions of quality, and so these are qualitative kind of like survey work, where you talk to faculty who've adopted open educational resources, you talk to students who faculty have assigned them open educational resources, and say, how do the quality of these things compare to other materials that either you as a faculty member have used in the past or you as a student have been assigned in the past. In this case, the review includes studies covering about 4,500 students and faculty, and what you see here is 85% saying the quality is the same or better, where there is still some minority saying, I actually like those commercial textbooks better. But you can see in terms of outcomes, and I've got a whole separate talk on the research piece of this that I'm really, I'd like to geek out on, but I won't. The results of using these open educational resources in place of commercial materials are really quite good. And now you say, why would that be true? Why does using one textbook, why would it make a difference? How much difference does a textbook actually make? Doesn't the majority of the learning, isn't it attributable to the teacher and not to the textbook? Yes, that's certainly true. But conceptualize the problem this way, right? A problem of cost, where the costs of textbooks are growing 3 times faster than inflation, and the average student is asked to spend $1,200 a year on instructional materials, that cost problem turns into an access problem, where 6 out of 10 students sometimes go without their instructional materials because of cost, and almost a quarter of students regularly report deciding not to buy the required textbooks for their courses because of cost. And over a third of students taking fewer courses than they would have otherwise because of that. So the cost problem translates into an access problem. That access problem translates into an outcomes problem, right? So you'd see at 4-year schools that we would classify as open access institutions, schools offering 4-year degree programs, the 6-year graduation rate is 33%. And at community colleges, even where we're only talking about 2-year programs, fewer than half of students ever accomplish the goal, the academic goal that they set out to accomplish. So, if that's one statement of the problem, is one solution to the problem, say, well, if we remove the cost issues, then can we also remove the access issues? If you can remove the access issues, then shouldn't the outcomes move a little bit? So it's not even about the instructional design of the materials. It's not about the production quality of the materials, whether they're printed on glossy paper and with high-resolution photography and hardback covers or something like that. It's purely about providing better access to more students in a more equitable way. Well, this whole infrastructure piece is the reason we're talking about infrastructure, it's supposed to enable innovation. It's supposed to be a petri dish where innovation can happen, right? So what are these other kind of downstream productive activities that we want the open education infrastructure to support? And now these are the kinds of diagrams you're used to seeing, right? What are we building on top of outcomes, activities, and resources? Well, we're talking about things like pedagogy. The kinds of things I can do in the classroom, the kinds of things I can ask students to do. On top of teaching and learning models, we're talking about credentialing models. On top of credentialing models, we're talking about business models. How do these institutions continue to stay in business in the future? I think open pedagogy is probably, of course, not only did I spend 15 years as a tenured faculty member, but my discipline was educational technology, and particularly instructional design inside of that is an interest of mine. And so open pedagogy is one of the parts that's most interesting to me. And by open pedagogy, I mean, what are the things I can do in my classroom when I can assume that my outcomes, my assessments, the resources I'm giving to students are open, that I can't do when they're not open? What's new that I can do? A couple of examples. How are we on time? Can you tell me what time it is? 20 after. Okay. So I'm going to skip that example. Let me talk about this example for a moment. So Ian mentioned that earlier in my career I worked on learning objects before I realized that the issue with learning objects, and hopefully everybody's figured this out by now, the problem with learning objects was that the reuse, the revise, the remix, all those pieces were essentially impossible to do. If you remember the reusability paradox, the root cause of the reusability paradox is a permissions problem. The way you fix most of the things that were wrong with learning objects was just to add an open license, and then the entire reusability paradox goes away. So anyway, before I realized I needed to be interested in open educational resources, I used to be interested in learning objects. And this is a graduate seminar that I was teaching. And for this particular seminar, I realized the experience I wanted my students to have was I wanted to get a room, maybe 10 people in a room, and have those people argue about different topics every week. And I wanted my students to be able to listen to those arguments. So I wanted, a software engineer in the room. I wanted a president of a publishing company in the room. I wanted a hardcore quantitative researcher in the room. I wanted an open source zealot in the room. I wanted a bunch of people to sit around a table and argue about these different issues pertaining to learning objects. This day was about the reusability paradox in particular. And when I realized that, of course, I could never get all those people in the room so that students could listen to them argue, I was sad for a while. And then I realized, hey, I could actually take the summer and write each of these arguments out, basically just write scripts for a sitcom where every episode they'd all get in the room, they'd have the argument, they'd actually have exactly the argument I wanted them to have because I'd be writing what they would say, and then I could have my students read these transcripts, and that would be that. So back in 2005, 2006, I had started getting into the habit of throwing all the things I was doing into a wiki, and I thought, well, here's a place where I'm sure as I'm writing this, I'm sure I'm misspelling something somewhere, my punctuation's bad somewhere. If I put it in the wiki, my students will come along behind me and be kind to me and clean some of that up. And that is not what happened in this case. I don't know if you can see, but at the beginning of each of these lines, there's a single letter, and that's telling us who it is that's speaking. It's Olive, the open source zealot, or Danny, the developer, or Vinny, the vice president of this company, or whatever. 2 or 3 weeks into class, I was reading what I had written over the summer in preparation to go into class and talk about it. And partway into the conversation, there was a character there that I didn't recognize. And Tina, the teacher, who had a particular K-12 perspective on the issue we were talking about that day, had come to join the conversation and was contributing her perspective to the conversation. And I had no idea who Tina was. She certainly wasn't my character. But one of the students who had come out of K-12 thought, oh, actually, there's a really interesting kind of public school perspective on this, and she hit the edit tab and she started writing in Tina. And Tina started showing up from time to time during the course of the semester. And it's not the use of the permissions, and it's not the use of the technology that I had imagined. But it turns out it was a far more interesting use of the technology and the permissions than I had imagined, because the students actually began co-creating the core instructional material for the course. And I'd never seen anything like that before. And that made me think, that led me to this little phrase at the top, which I love, which is that openness facilitates the unexpected. It's kind of a recognition that I don't know all of the goodness that could happen with regard to this, and I don't even know the best way for it to be used. I know how I intended to use it, but by putting an open license on it, and putting it in a place where people could exercise those permissions granted to them by the license, it allows unanticipated goodness to happen. So I've slightly modified this definition here about creating benefits for society through the facilitation of unexpected downstream productive activities. That's part of what openness does. So as I thought more about that with my faculty member hat on, started thinking about the assignments I was giving students and the way students are always complaining. Well, students are always complaining, just period. So just take that as a given. But one of their favorite kind of tropes to complain about is the types of assignments that we give them as faculty. So, for example, you ask them to read a chapter, and then to make sure that everybody's read the chapter, you ask them to write a one-page response essay. Or to make sure that everybody read the story we're talking about in literature class today, you ask them to write a one-page response essay. And these kinds of assignments, or in an online class where you say everyone must post on the discussion board at least 2 times per week, and each post must contain at least 150 words. And it cannot just be, oh, I agree with the previous poster. It has to, we drum up these crazy things that we ask them to do, and they hate doing them almost as much as we hate grading them, if we're honest about it. And all of us understand that at the end of the day, when we pass that assignment back to them, if it's a physical assignment, its destiny is the garbage can. Right? That one-page response thing that you wrote so I can make sure that you read, yeah, you kind of half wrote it, I sort of half read it, here you go. B, garbage can. Right? And that's kind of their interaction with a lot, not all of the assignments, but with many of the assignments, they have this kind of disposable feeling about them. So, what would happen in terms of open pedagogy? What if all the materials that we're working with are open? How could I go from disposable assignments to something like a renewable assignment? Is it possible that I could give students an assignment that they would actually enjoy doing because they would see value in it, and that there would be actual value for me in grading it? And at the end of all of that effort that we've all put in together, the world is actually a better place rather than the garbage can is more filled than it was before. So here are a couple of examples. And you can find this video just by Googling blogs versus wikis. It'll be one of the very first things that comes up. This is in a class I was teaching on, this will tell you how old it is, new media and learning. This is back when blogs and wikis were still new media. And this particular assignment, this is one of my all-time favorite assignments. It's the Kung Fu assignment, where basically students go out and they find some old public domain PSAs or other video, and they do a bad kind of Kung Fu style dubbing over top of it to change what the video is actually about. So if you watch this video, this is a Kennedy and Nixon debate. And the student team that put this video together realized, hey, there's something kind of fun here. Like, let's see, what are the primary differences between blogs and wikis? Well, on a wiki, like anybody can come say anything they want to say. Anybody can hit that edit tab. But on blogs, really only the blog author. People can post comments, but the author of the blog really has more control over that. So let's have Nixon argue for blogs and have him talk about the Watergate blog that he's just published, where he can control the messaging and the information that's available to the media. And then Kennedy's going to represent wikis. What can we have him do? Kennedy has to close this debate by saying, ask not what your wiki can do for you, but what you can do for your wiki. Right? So the students did all this great, they looked through all this video, they thought about the principles involved in the two tools, what was different about them. They found this particular old video. They did this great dubbing over it where they tried to do the voice of Nixon and tried to do the voice of Kennedy, and it kind of comes off okay a lot of the time. But instead of an assignment where it was, please write no less than 5, no more than 10 pages about the difference between blogs and wikis, they made this video, which is super entertaining, comes up on the first page of Google when you search for blogs and wikis, and you can see their homework assignment has been viewed over 52,000 times. This is the homework assignment they did for a class. But it's actually adding value to the world. And because students knew that people would be seeing it and it would go out, and it actually had a chance of improving the life of somebody next semester that took the course who wondered, what's the difference between blogs and wikis? They invested more time in it. When I gave feedback on it, I knew I was giving feedback on something that would eventually go out and be public and be useful to someone, so I was more engaged in my feedback. It was better all the way around. Another example, this is an online book called Project Management for Instructional Designers. This is a course I used to teach. As you might imagine, there is no book called Project Management for Instructional Designers because it's just too narrow an area. No one is ever going to write that book. So what we did was we took a book called Introduction to Project Management, which was written from a business school perspective and was full of examples about you have to get 30,000 tons of rebar and 4 million tons of concrete to Shanghai, and they all have to arrive within 36 hours of each other and coordinate this logistics problem or something that none of my students cared about. We took this book, and the assignments for this class are assignments that slowly turned the book from a project management book into a book about project management for instructional designers. The URL for this book is PM number 4id.org, pm4id.org. And there's kind of, you can see on the front page here, there's a list of some of the types of changes that students have made to this book over the years. So they went through, and all those little yellow boxes that have little miniature case studies in them, they pulled all those out and wrote new case studies from an education perspective. And you can imagine that the difference between answering multiple choice questions about a principle of project management or having to internalize a principle of project management to the degree where you can write a new case study, it represents a different level of learning and of effort on the student's part. Some of them redid those case studies. Some of them redid the assignments at the end of the chapters. Some of them said, you know what, this is a book, it's all writing, this thing needs some multimedia. So a group of students went out and found 3 different practicing project managers who manage instructional design projects and shot little video case studies with them. So at the beginning of each chapter, you'll see 3 videos on the topic of the chapter that the students shot, edited, produced, and built in here, and the faculty are responding to prompts that the students have come up with. There's something called the Project Management Professional, the PMP certification, which is a certificate that students can earn. And at the beginning of this class, I would always tell them, you should be excited to be in this. No one was ever excited to be in this class. You should be excited to be in this class because people with a PMP certification on average have a salary of $106,000 a year. So, be excited about this class. If nothing else, maybe you can go earn this certification and get a good-paying job. But the books that you need to study for the certification exam, of course, all cost like $180 or $220. So one year, a group of students went through and organized this book and articulated the book with the sections of the PMP certification exam so that now you can use this book to study for the certification exam and things like this. It's a very different book now than it used to be early on. And all those changes were made by students who were doing that instead of writing response essays and answering questions on discussion boards and taking multiple choice quizzes and things like that. And then the final example, coming from a slightly different perspective, I teach class, it's called Introduction to Open Education, and a couple of years ago I got frustrated with there not being a reader for that, and so I went through over the summer and identified what I thought were kind of the seminal readings about openness from the perspective of education, and then students came along, and as we, this is a smaller class, this is a graduate seminar, and so there's a lot of discussion in this class. And instead of me writing discussion questions, I had students write discussion questions. I had them write summaries of each article. What are the key points? What's the historical significance? What are the main takeaways? Each student wrote that up for every assignment, and each student posted that on a blog that was public-facing. And then at the end of the year, each student became responsible for 4, 5, 6 of the readings that we covered, and they went back and mined all of the things written by all of the other students in the class, all the discussion questions, all the summaries, all the key takeaways, and synthesized those into one piece so that now what this reader represents actually, the actual readings aren't in the reader, the links to the readings are in the reader. You can get to the cathedral and the bazaar from here, but what you can find that my students have done is, what are the questions you should talk about in class on the day that you talk about cathedral and the bazaar? What's the historical significance of cathedral and the bazaar? What was the historical context and things like that. And every student knew that at the end of the term, every other student was going to come through and be reviewing all of their writing to pull that all together and synthesize it. So there's a public performance kind of piece of this that comes into play. Anyway, all these examples of renewable assignments, you'll see it's possible to have students do this kind of work when the core materials are open. You can't turn a project management book into a project management for instructional designers book if that book is fully copyrighted, all rights reserved. I have to go navigate that permissions process with Pearson and then pay them some unknown amount of money for permission for my students to make that book into the book we need it to be. I'll just touch on this very quickly because I think we are just about out of time. But having worked a number of times now for the last several years with several dozen institutions as they make the switch from commercial textbooks to open educational resources and make the switch more broadly, there are kind of 3 ways that faculty engage with open assessments, open outcomes, and open educational resources. And the first is just to say, you know what, just give me an open textbook. I'll just use it instead of the textbook I'm using now. I'll keep doing everything else the same. I don't have time to engage in a whole course redesign process. I just want to replace it. And that's awesome. And what you'll see is that of course, students are going to save a significant amount of money, and you'll see little to no change in student success because you'll see that little bump that I talked about earlier just from the increase in access, but nothing drastic. But when you can at least get faculty to realign, when you can get them to go back to learning outcomes and say, these are the outcomes for my course. I'm going to pretend that no textbook exists. Here are the learning goals I have. For each learning objective, I'm going to go find open educational resources and open assessments that support that objective. Then I'm going to do it again for the next objective. And I'm just going to let the learning outcomes on my syllabus be the table of contents for this new thing I'm going to create. And create that through alignment, aggregate the best OER for each outcome. Then in addition to saving tons of money, you'll actually start to see moderate changes in learning there. And you'll see things on the end of semester smile sheets that the students fill out. You'll see comments like, the things we talked about in class were the same things I read. And it's like this magical revelation that those two things could actually connect together. Or, it seemed like my faculty member had actually read the book. Now, those of you who've taught a class in the past, how many of you have ever read every word of the book you assigned to students for the class that you taught? Then rethinking goes not just from using OER in this more granular outcomes-aligned way, but getting into rethinking your assessment strategy and starting to explore open pedagogy. And that's when you see really significant changes in student success. At Mercy College in New York several years ago, we supported Mercy in making a transition with their math classes from a bundle of a commercial publisher's book and their online practice system to open educational resources and an open source math practice system. And over 4 years, the pass rate in that course it was college algebra, went from 48% to 77%. And it's not just because of the access effect of switching from commercial to open, but they also engaged in all of these kinds of rethinking of their assessment strategy, rethinking their pedagogy at the same time that they made that switch. Open credential, I'll just, same kind of question. What can we do in terms of credentials when we can assume that the infrastructure is open that we can't do otherwise? Right, the canonical example here is the work at Tidewater Community College in Virginia, which now has what they call their Z degree. The Z degree is an entire degree program with zero textbook costs because in every required course and in the elective courses, they've replaced commercial textbooks with open educational resources. So, they had this idea in fall of 2012. We started working with them in in January of 2013. They launched in fall of 2013. And in fall of 2013, it was 25% cheaper to graduate from this program than it was in fall of 2012 because we'd taken all the textbook cost away. And I do have to put one little note in here about Lumen. Who's Lumen? What do we do? Lumen particularly is in the business of helping schools make this transition from textbooks to open educational resources, and particularly moving entire degree programs. So just in closing, so we have something to talk about during the break, like where is the tech in all of this? This is awesome, David. You've talked about a bunch of not tech stuff. How does the technical infrastructure come into play here? I think in terms of the technology, and we can geek out about technology and standards and stuff during the break, but I think we should ask these two same kinds of questions, right, in terms of democratizing innovation and permissionless innovation. What are we doing with these underlying technologies to democratize innovation in education and to actually permit innovation? So, a couple of examples, like, is it free? Yeah, but is it like, do I need a PhD to use it? If I do, it's probably not democratizing innovation. And in terms of permission, yes, we need an OSI-approved license. Yes, we want kind of interoperability in terms of permitting me to do different things, but what about the policies on my campus? Am I allowed to do the things that the technology enables me to do? Do I have to go beg somebody's permission to try something new? Or what about pedagogical assumptions? Ian was talking about OpenCast earlier, which I followed for a while, and it looks like a really awesome piece of tech. But you can't say that OpenCast is pedagogically agnostic. It's a lecture capture system, right? So a lot of times we think the technologies we're building are pedagogically agnostic, but it turns out that they're not. So I guess the last thing I want to say, kind of parting shot here, is how do we get out of the way? Like for me, as an instructional designer, I'm all about the design of the materials, the design of the assessments. Are the quiz items reliable? Are they valid? Obsessing about the technical pieces of the content. Other communities obsess about the technical pieces of the technology. But at the end of the day, all of us have to get out of the way and let the teaching and learning happen. Right? This emphasis on calling these things infrastructure is because they don't create benefits. They are not the benefit themselves. They create benefits by enabling or facilitating these other downstream productive activities. What's the benefit in a great LMS? It's what the faculty and students do with it, inside of it. What's the benefit of a great simulation or a great learning game? It's how the teacher uses it. It's how the students engage with it. We can't think about the things that we're making as the things themselves. We're making things that other people are going to go and use to do other things in this way that Brett is talking about. And that's why they're infrastructure. So I think it's really interesting what kind of alignment and synergy there can be when both the open education infrastructure and the open ed tech infrastructure both are kind of harnessed together and pulling in the same direction in terms of trying to democratize innovation, trying to grant permissions, and get out of the way so that other people can do exciting and interesting things. And with that, I will wrap up. Thank you.